Startups should only worry about compliance after they raise funding.
Fiction.
The FDA is becoming more flexible towards emerging medtech technologies.
Fact.
Most medtech founders don't fully understand their own regulatory pathway.
Fact.
Regulatory hurdles can make or break a medtech company. Today with me, Shaherah Yancy. She is the CEO of Research Lifecycle Solutions. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's give a bit of context of your company to our audience.
Yes, Research Lifecycle Solutions. The company was founded 3 years ago with the mission of helping startups and emerging medtech companies, and we've expanded. Now we're supporting biopharma and pharma development companies. But in terms of medtech, we focus on early companies, helping them through the commercialization process. So we focus on the regulatory piece as well as the clinical piece and some of the business management functions. But what's different or unique about us is we deliver that in a comprehensive package, if you will, to startups, because startups typically can't afford to hire a regulatory, a clinical, or several different consultants, and also they don't have teams just yet. So what we do is deliver that complete commercialization package or commercialization support to early startups at an affordable rate so that they can have access to the necessary support they need to get to market.
Amazing. We're going to go through some insights from your end, advices for our startup community. But before we're going to go into an icebreaker session, I'm going to give you some states, and you're going to tell me fact or fiction, all right? Perfect. So let's start. Regulation always slows innovation. What do you think of it?
That's fiction.
Fiction. Startups should only worry about compliance after they raise funding.
Fiction.
The FDA is becoming more flexible towards emerging medtech technologies.
Fact.
Most medtech founders don't fully understand their own regulatory pathway.
Fact.
Great innovation fails more often because of poor documentation than bad design.
Fiction.
All right. So now let's get into our topic. Definitely, regulation is one of the topics that might be scary, right, for medtech startups. How do you turn this feeling for them into a more positive outcome?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Regulatory can be scary. The way that I look at it is how to win with regulatory. Understanding that regulatory is actually your business strategy. It is not just compliance, it is not just a checkbox. If you utilize it correctly, it is your business strategy. And what I mean by that is regulatory is actually the cornerstone to the major milestones that any founder, any startup will need to get to market. What I mean by that is when you're fundraising, that's the first thing we do, right? We're fundraising. Investors want to know what's going to be the return on investment. They're not just listening to say if this is a great product. They're listening to see if they will invest in a product, right? So you need to be able to articulate your regulatory journey. When am I going to get to market? How much money do I need to get to market? So that's one point of regulatory. The second piece is product development. When you're developing your device, you have to understand the regulatory compliance measures, the ISOs, the different regulations and guidelines, right, when you're developing a product. So that's the second way that regulatory fits into. The third thing is the actual regulatory path when you're working with FDA, or if you're in Europe, whatever notified body or regulatory body you're working with, that's regulatory. Clinical. Your clinical trials need to support regulatory. No one does a clinical trial because it's fun. You're doing a clinical trial to adhere to either compliance or what have you. The last thing, market access or market adoption, I would say. Once you get to market, that's not the finish line, that's the beginning, right? So regulatory, understanding what you need to support your claims. You cannot make a claim just because you feel like it, right? you have to understand what is required from a regulatory standpoint to make claims. So when I say win with regulatory, it's understanding that regulatory is actually your business strategy. That is how you will move throughout the commercialization process, but not only to get to market, but what it's going to take to be successful and stay on the market.
Indeed. When a startup is looking into exploring other markets, global market access, regulation is also as well, of course, very important part. How do you recommend advice for them to handle this part of their um, global access?
Yes. Well, first thing I would say is understand it's a strategic approach. Let's not look at it as a linear path. Let's look at it comprehensively, right? For example, if you are in the US and ultimately you want to go to Europe, know that data can be utilized in multiple ways, right? You can maximize your data, you can leverage your data. But let's go back to regulatory. Understanding that running a clinical study, utilizing the international standards can support your data to be utilized in the US as well as Europe as well as China. So there are multiple ways. So again, you want to look at it from a very strategic and comprehensive pathway first, regardless if you execute on it. Not saying that you have to go after US and Europe at the same time, but build out your roadmap first so that you can leverage the data, build a clinical study that's going to be fit for multi-purpose versus running 2 or 3 clinical studies linearly.
Yeah.
So that's what I always recommend first. Understand where you're going. Speed means absolutely nothing if you don't know where you're going. So let's map out where and how and then execute.
Indeed, because if this is not planned in advance, then it will become, instead of fasting the process, is gonna make it come back, right?
Exactly.
Now, blind spots. When startups come and they completely forget small part of this regulation pathway. What's usually the mistake of these startups?
Yes, the usual mistake is waiting too long. I find that most founders spend most of their time building the product. They're stuck in the product development phase. They want a perfect product before they engage with regulatory. That is not the case. If you wait to build your product before engaging, you're already 1 or 2 years behind. Here's why. You present your product to FDA, and they tell you your verification is not adequate to move into clinical trials, let alone move into patients, right? So you have to go back, unfreeze your design, rebuild your product based on the specs that you didn't realize you needed in the regulatory phase. So that's actually the biggest challenge I see with early companies, spending way too much time in the product development phase trying to develop a perfect product. But the product is not set until you get the regulatory layer, the regulatory eyes and perspective into your product before you freeze that product. Also, that comes into play, I would say, when I see founders build a product and it's not built for the exact purpose that will fulfill the patient's need.
Right.
It may not fit into the workflow of the hospital. So again, you have to go back and tweak. And sometimes when you make those tweaks, your product is no longer a class 2. Maybe you've made it a class 3 product. So again, understand regulatory before you finish your product. Somewhere in the middle of product development, I really suggest early on when you first start, understand what you need. But at least somewhere in the middle, you should understand the regulatory aspects before moving forward. That is the biggest hurdle I see. There are a couple of others, but that's the number one.
If you would have the chance to change or modify, redesign MedTech approval process, what would you redesign?
Yeah, so that's, I think the process should encompass, I think regulatory approval should encompass all aspects in terms of preclinical or your validation, your regulatory, as well as your clinical needs. I think it should be mandatory to have all of those components when you do your submission or when you do your pre-submission, I would say. The reason why companies often lose time, lose money, lose resources, or even have a lack of understanding is because they submit without understanding that, oh, this is what I need for verification or validation. So they're only getting a perspective on a small section. They're only getting a perspective on their classification or pathway. Well, yes, your classification or pathway can be determined based on what you have submitted, but once you get to the final design, that may look a lot different. So I really think the regulatory process can be improved if it were mandatory to come to your pre-submission or your first submission with all of those components in place, because it forces the founder or the company to think about all of those aspects at one time. And I think it'll save time for the regulators. It'll save resources for them if you just have a confined time to view everything versus modular pieces.
Indeed. All right, Shaherah, thank you very much for your insights, and we hope to see you in MedTech Malta 2025.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much.